Hey there! Today I crafted a standard Elves deck. This deck mostly revolves around the tribal abilities with Campfire, Shadow Sage, and Haunting Voyage, and we will be playing some games with it. So a deck overview. This is a black-green deck with its main win con of chipping your enemy's health with Campfire Shadow Sage, where its enter the battlefield ability gives an option if you want to make your opponents lose life depending on how many of the same creature types you have in play. The more elves you have, the more health the opponent loses. The other option can be helpful if we need to stall some time. It is important that we have at least one Campfire Shadow Sage in the graveyard so we can reanimate it by Return Upon the Tide and Haunting Voyage. It is also important that our Haunting Voyage is foretold so that we have every elf from our graveyard returned to the battlefield for Campfire Shadow Sage. So with that strategy, we have cards that can mill, like Coma's Faithful, and cards that can search for other elves, like Harald, King of Scamfar. So now, we fight. On the first round, I am able to foretell Haunting Voyage on turn 2. This will be very important as we want all of our elves to be there for the Shadow Sage, and our opponent seems to be playing Warpal Sword. And while we set up for the play here, let me talk about some other cards that is really recommended for this strategy. And first would be Elves War Master. I don't have any copies of him, so he wasn't here in the first place. And next, maybe Canopy Tactician. Maybe just even a singleton copy of her would be very good since aggro is not really our stance here. So, once the standard rotates out, as well as some cards we have here like Llanowar Visionary and Dayara, you wouldn't have too much of a problem adjusting this deck to the new standard since most of the cards here are from Kaldheim, which would still be around once the rotation happens. So our opponent had already have 6 lands while I have enough money to cast Harald to get more elves for the Shadow Sage later. Then our opponent casted Skeletal Swarming, a really dangerous card to see. Then we have already enough elves to chip our opponent's health to 3, in which after that he conceded. And that ends round 1 with us having 1-0. On the second round, I have kept my opening hand for Roots of Wisdom. Maybe we could have some important cards retrieved, but by the time I casted it, we only have land. Then our opponent casts Improbable Alliance, which we can clearly tell that this is a double draw deck with a Fairy Vandal or an Ironcrag Pyromancer. So I let him do his thing first since there's really nothing that I can do. Then a few turns later I use Binding the Old Gods to get the Improbable Alliance removed, but the tiny fairies were already a big trouble for us. So I cast Campfire Shadow Sage to gain 2 health. It wasn't enough, so after maybe a few turns I have used the Shadow Sage once again to gain 4 health. I attacked with Coma's Faithful, and when it died from a fairy, it milled no elves. And then on a few turns, he was still shy for attacking, and then it came. Crippling Fear was encountered, and it removed everything aside from a single Fairy Vandal. And at this point, I was just waiting him to kill my Shadow Sages so they get reanimated, and that is probably all for round 2, with a 2-0 record for our deck. The third round started slow with our opponent casting Mirror Shield, It looks like our opponent here is trying to play something worth protecting, so I'll keep that in mind while I set up my board state, and by turn 4, there it is. He's going to play Mutate, and then on the next turn he equipped the Hemophage with the Mirror Shield, so I need something to kill it without Death Touch. So what I did is to bait out Herald for the Hemophage, then cast Crippling Fear after, killing both of his creatures, but then he casts another Hemophage, and this time I have no removal, so I have nothing against it, but I do have enough to kill our opponent for a 3-0 win. It is weird to see another opponent playing the same lands you have, because in the 4th and final round for this video, we have someone playing Bastion of Remembrance and probably Sacrifice. And there wasn't that much interaction for the first few turns, which is good, and I started to have an advantage since I got him to discard 2 10-Tempest. Then I managed to get Campfire PhantaZsh via Herald Unites the Elves, and then we managed to destroy the Bastion with Binding the Old Gods, and with that I can freely attack without losing my health through the Bastion. He then casted his own Crippling Fear. He then casted his own Crippling Fear, killing all but my PhantaZsh, but we have another PhantaZsh milled via Coma's Faithful, and after a few turns, he casted Demigod Titan, which would be sacrificed later to 10-Tempest, and he chump blocked all those pests to kill 2 of my remaining elves, thinking it would be enough to stall for time, but I have enough lands for the foretold Haunting Voyage, winning the game outright with a probable 16 damage to the face. So in the end, that's a 4-0 win. I am loving combos that wins the game outright, and 4-0 is really not of a big deal since it is just 4 games. I have to remind you, this deck relies on graveyard, so it wouldn't be strong all the time. And so with that, until then.